whew, I think it's hitting me right now. Like I'm getting this right now as I'm speaking to you. I think about the Israelites, right? I think about Eve. And when I think about the Israelites, I think about complaint being on their lip first, right? Because they weren't getting what they believed they ought to get in the time in which they ought to get it, all the things, and reading these passages that they wanted to go back to a familiar dysfunction in Egypt just to avoid they wanted to go back to a familiar dysfunction in Egypt just to avoid the unfamiliar, uncomfortable place God was taking them into. Therefore, they didn't believe that God could provide for them in accordance to how they wanted, therefore treating God like a genie and not like the Holy One, not like the sovereign God, not like the all-powerful, all-knowing God we know him to be. And that convicts me. Welcome back to another episode of Eat, Don't Compete, and I am your girl, Jasmine DeWeese. It's good to be back. It's good to see your faces. It's good to be back another week to talk about the Lord and talk about how good he's been and about what he's doing in my life, in hopes that you can connect with what he's doing in my life for how he's moving and maneuvering in your life. Before we go any further with our topic for today, I honestly want you to stop for a second and press that subscribe button. I want to make sure that you're in the know as we continue to share the gospel, as we continue to spread the good news. I want to make sure that you're in connection with us. I want to make sure that you have the content, that you share the content so that you don't gatekeep, share with your family and your friends. You get in those comments, and we form this community so that we're growing one with another. So we're walking alongside each other as we grow spiritually. So now that we've gotten that business out the way, I want to talk. I think today we're going to start a series on success, Christian success. I think that a lot of times we come into the faith with all of these things we know, right? These things we have an understanding about. But what we find is that we need to unlearn a few things. We need to redefine a few definitions. And a lot of times we don't do that immediately, and it confuses a lot of us. And at least for me, there was some confusion there. So I'll jump right in. There are some things that I feel like I've wrestled with this particular topic that we're going to discuss today, all of my adult life. Why? Because I am highly ambitious. Just as a person, maybe it came as a survival technique or something that I had going on growing up. But whatever the case may be, I'm ambitious. And in being ambitious, when you come into the faith and you begin to learn a little bit more about God, and leave in the comments, are you an ambitious person? Are you more of a laid back person? Do you have, are you systematic and perfectionist or a recovering perfectionist like myself? How can you relate to that particular topic? Leave it right down in the comments. For me, the Lord took me on a path of really wringing out my sin in a way that's having me to understand a little bit more about being more self-aware, right? Because how are we aware of everyone else except for ourselves, right? And how can, based on the culture we live in, the society we live in, we run away from being self-aware. We run because it sounds a little bit too much like self-help, and as if it's a bad thing to be self-aware. But I think that you can't even really get to really, as you really get to know God, you get to know yourself, you get to know the good things, you get to know the bad things, and a whole lot of the bad things, way more than the good things. So what I'm beginning to, where the Lord's making me understand a little bit more about my own self, my own hidden proclivities. And because I have this particular platform, I actually have a responsibility to not shy away from the understanding that someone else may be going through what I've gone through. And it is a is pressed upon me to share that with you guys so that you don't have to go through the same route that I've gone through, and so on and so forth. Or at least have some tools, some resources to further your understanding of how the Lord is working within you. So in that, I've talked to you guys about selfish ambition and how the Lord began to unfold some of those things to me about me. And in that, he took me down this road of he started to whisper covetousness to me. And so it took me on a path of discontentment. And so I've known that, for a while that I have these pockets of time where I feel successful, and in other pockets of times I don't feel successful, because that's the human part of me. So there's this imbalance of discontentment. And so when I begin to study about it, and I'm yet still studying about it, I begin to understand that my discontentment, years ago when I first started the podcast, when I would strive very hard for the success and go this route that the world says I ought to go, because my content wasn't necessarily based upon the gospel, wasn't necessarily spreading the good news. So in that, I would base my success upon worldly success. So what I began to understand is that I changed the goalposts of what success looked like over and over again. And I remember listened to a sermon by Pastor Stephen Furtick, and he was just like, at the end of the day, you define your success. And I know I'm chopping and screwing his words, so I know it came out way better than this. But you define success through the lens of Christ and keep it there. But I think a lot of times, when I'm at the gym and I'm working, and I tend to, if I'm doing a workout with weights, I'm looking in the mirror, right? I'm hyper fixated on myself. But I've found, and sometimes I'm doing this thing where I balance, where I put the weight in the ear and I put my arm to the side. I can't do it now, but the weight in the ear, my arm to the side, and I begin to lift my leg up and down. And that's a balancing act. I remember one day, an older woman came to me, was like, give me 5, because that balance was that balance was amazing. But I've also found that if I am not hyper fixated on myself, then I will be looking at other people looking at me. And that throws me off. And that always throws my balance off. So why do I say that? I use that as a definition, as an example about how we can become discontent if we take our eyes off of what is we're supposed to be hyper fixated on, what we're supposed to be focused on, what we're supposed to be leaning into. And so I did that a lot with the podcast. And so now I often do these polls, whether it's amongst friends, whether it's in conversation, but I'm always assessing something. So I come to this understanding about discontentment. I'm like, so what is that? So if that's discontentment, how do you not be discontent? And in being content, I've read the scripture that Paul mentions. I'll leave it below. But I read the scripture that Paul mentions, and Paul mentions that he had to learn to be content. He had to learn to be content. And I thought that language was beautiful, and it wasn't a mistake. It was no coincidence, because I think that what we believe is that our grandmothers were always that saved, right? We believe that our pastors always had faith that large. We believe that the mothers of the church always could pray with that amount of depth. But it's like practiced behavior, because that's the route I want to take. So I got they got hyper fixated on their faith. They got hyper fixated on their prayer life. They stayed the course and remained focused. So getting back to this point about being discontent, I was like, well, I need to know what success is. I need to know what the definition of success is as a Christian. And we're going to break down as much as we can, the different components of success as it pertains as being a Christian and being successful, right? what are the merits, the measures? How can I measure success as a Christian, right? And how can I measure success in my business as a Christian? And it's not necessarily the fruits of the spirit, because the fruits of the spirit are not bringing me money. We're going to go do all of those things. But today I do want to focus in on contentment and what learning about being discontent did for me. I want to define it, but I feel like the definition is going to constantly be doing what its definition does. So I'll try to define it today, but I want to get into this conversation. I think that what I believed about contentment revealed what I believed about God. I'm going to say that again. I believe that what I believed about contentment actually revealed what I believed about God. Because if I believe that God is a sovereign God, right, then how can I believe that whatever it is he give me is not enough, and he is not enough? That's a confusion, paradox, if you will. But if I believe that he's a sovereign God, then I also have to be content with whatever it is that he gives me to get done. But it revealed that I don't believe he's actually as sovereign as I might say he is, because the wrestle is with how I feel and in believing how I feel. That's good. So it's important that we don't so we're going to have these feelings, these adverse feelings, so whatever, because as Paul said, we had to learn, right? You are still learning to be content. So you have to choose that perspective early on. And in that, you have to train yourself, because the reality of it is you might be lifting 25 pounds in January, right? But by December, because you trained your muscles to get used to the 25, you might go to 50, you might go to 40, you might go to 70, but whatever it is, it's based upon your training, your consistency, your persistence, So with discontentment being defined, as this deep dissatisfaction with God's providence, because God's providence being his sovereignty, his ability, his power to do and provide for you. I think it's hitting me right now. Like I'm getting this right now as I'm speaking to you. It's help. So when I think about discontentment as this biblical definition of discontentment specifically, I think about the Israelites, right? I think about Eve. And when I think about the Israelites, I think about complaint being on their lips first, right? Complaint being on their lips because they weren't getting what they believed they ought to get in the time in which they ought to get it, all the things. And I remember, in reading these passages, that they wanted to go back to a familiar dysfunction in Egypt just to avoid They wanted to go back to a familiar dysfunction in Egypt just to avoid the unfamiliar, uncomfortable place God was taking them into. Therefore, they didn't believe that God could provide for them in accordance to how they wanted, therefore treating God like a genie and not like the Holy One, not like the sovereign God, not like the all-powerful, all-knowing God we know him to be. And that convicts me. That has me sitting here like, are you an Israelite? Like, are you an Israelite when God is providing manna from heaven, but because your definition is so far-fetched for what you believe success ought to be, how are you going to come into a job and then define how success is viewed within said job? You're coming to the job of being a Christian, and yet you want to define success how you want to define success, and if success is not defined like that, then you begin to rumble and you begin to complain, and the manna from heaven is no longer good enough for you. Ooh, my God. This commentary, it says that we need to learn to tune out the expensive enticements and concentrate instead on the truly good life, living in a relationship with God and doing his works. And as I studied on discontentment, and I studied about being content as it pertains to defining success in the Lord, I was fascinated by this overwhelming. When I first came into the faith, like for real, right? I continue to see this perspective, right? This viewpoint, this mindset over and over by different believers. And this is what I'm seeing now. I'm seeing it now in these passages. It's saying that, we need to focus our attention on our relationships with God outside. That's the fixation, right? That's the hyper fixation that I am here in this frame, right? Everything outside of this frame does not matter, right? Like if God does give me the worldly definition of success because I'm hyper fixated on him, then so be it. If God does not give me the worldly definition of success, then I'm okay and I'm successful regardless, as long as I'm in his will, as long as I am focused on him, as long as my heart is right with him, as long as I am fulfilling the things about him. And we are actually going to talk a lot more about that in other episodes, because I am going to, in our devotional episode next week, we're going to definitely get into Joshua, so that we can talk a little bit more about when Joshua came into leadership and how the Lord defined success in that particular context. So I think that a lot of times, and I think this episode is for you if you quietly or even loudly, no judgment, if you quietly or loudly carry the weight of I should be further, or I should be doing more for the Lord, or other people look like they doing this, or success is it, or success. Why is my success not looking like her success? And a lot of that is centered around not being hyper fixated on the plate that's before you, in looking over at other people's. So I definitely, when I thought about discontentment, particularly, I thought about Luke 12 and 15. And it's so much in that passage. I'm not even going to break it down, but I know that there's a component within that passage that talks about being on guard for covetousness. And that's another, I guess you could say, big word, if you will. I think that Jesus in this, because this is Jesus speaking at this point. I think that Jesus ties discontentment with misplaced value system. And I want to sit there for a second. Tying discontentment with misplaced value system. As I think about the discontentment that I've had and how discontentment will flare up, like, like an eczema flare up, or other flare ups that people have, these different disorders and things of that nature. What I've found is that if there's a misplaced value system, that is the root to why discontentment happens, or why it continues to happen. Because I'm not going to place discontentment as a chronic situation for me, something that's going to be so ongoing. It might have taken me a long time to get up out of this place, but I'm not taking full ownership of it. I'm going to, I believe that the Lord can deliver me from it. And it's my hope that by the end of this episode, that you believe that the Lord can deliver you from it. But misplaced value system, like because I think that a lot of the sin that the Lord is bringing out, there's roots to it, right? Like there's a foundational why in everything that we do. There's a foundational why in all the behaviors that we have. There's a foundational why as to when you came to the faith in the first place. There's a foundational why as to how you move and shake throughout your life. So when they say this misplaced value system, it's revealing that I've placed my value outside of God. That, a lot of times we say, Lord, you're all in all. Lord, you're the best. And Lord, you're Jehovah Jireh. And Lord, you're my provider. And Lord, I believe you. And Lord, I trust you. And Lord, I'm faithful to you. And all the while, our lives are not a reflection of those words. And I want my life to be a reflection of those words. So I definitely think it's a challenge for me to share this with you because it's a little bit more vulnerable. But I think that that's a confused theological understanding of what and who God is, what God can do, and me misplacing my values in areas that would never fulfill me in the first place. So as I think about this, I think a lot about, us saying these different things that sound churchy, right? And we're defining our success within the realms of those things on our lips. But what are we doing? What are we holding near and dear in our heart, right? Are we holding, I host a podcast. Am I holding visibility in my heart? Am I holding influence in my heart? Am I holding accolades in my heart? Am I holding money in my heart? Am I holding likes, clicks, and, speed and acceleration and recognition in my heart? And I want you to start to think about that as it pertains to you and what you're holding in your heart, because what you're holding in your heart, I say it often enough to say, what you have in you is bound to come out of you. I think it was Dr. Brown that actually said that too. Like, it's not, you might think you're hiding. You might hide very well from the average person, but somebody somewhere is going to recognize that you're a fraud. And even if it's God who recognizes enough to expose it to you privately so that you can scream it out to the rooftops publicly and then turn around and be changed permanently. Yeah, so I think that's the current transition. I'm looking forward to going over Joshua 1, 7, and 8 for next week's devotional. And I'm going to leave it here. I think that this was a great episode to start the series on defining success as a Christian, because I think that if we don't define success as a Christian the right way, we will be viewing our success within Christianity and outside of Christianity. Because when you're outside of Christianity, you're working within that world, you're in the world, but you're in the world, but you're not of the world. So you shouldn't be defining your success the way the world does, because if you do, you will always be off balance. You will always be off balance. So I want to make sure that this is something that you're interested in. Leave it in the comments if you're interested in this particular series, if you're interested in having further conversations, if you're interested in having one-on-one conversations about this particular topic, because I think that as Christians, it's important that we join together in making sure that girding one another up, walking alongside one another as we journey through and grow spiritually. Like, it's important that we grow spiritually, because we're going to have conversations about fruitfulness, and fruitfulness being a component of Christian success. Being fruitful in that being different, very different than the fruitfulness of the Lord. Because if we're talking about success right now for me particularly with under the umbrella of having a podcast, there is something specific that I need to continue to keep at the forefront of my head and heart so that I don't grow discontent in an area, right? Because I can't even define success the same way in Eat, Don't Compete before when I started in 2018, the same way I do now. My fixation is on Christ. And that's not me trying to say, I'm better than anybody, but my success then versus my success now looks different. I can't define it differently. Like, as long as I am staying within the will of God, and as long as God's hand is upon me, and as long as I am doing the things that we're going to talk about next week in Joshua 1, then I am successful. But I am still unlearning a lot of my worldliness. I'm still unlearning my fleshliness. I'm still unlearning a lot of the different things. And so within the series, I want to make sure that we talk about things like that. We're talking about the feelings of discontentment. Just as a Christian, we're going to talk about defining the success a little bit more deeply. But I wanted to give the foundation of discontentment, and because there might be a reason why you need to define success. You might not deal with discontentment like me, but when you do, I want to make sure that we've covered some of that. I want to talk about defining success. I want to talk about success and fruitfulness of visibility, obedience, the cause, measuring, and probably more eternity, measuring tools and metrics of success as a Christian. Like, you got to understand that, we're not talking about striving. We're not talking about hustling. We're not talking about doing more. We're talking about stewardship. And so I appreciate you guys popping in today and sharing in this topic with me. I'll be sure to, within this series, I want to share new music that I'm listening to. I'll share that in the show notes. Supplemental material that's keeping me on the boat and not waving and going with the wind. But I do want to, just simply leave you with this. I think that a lot of times, don't allow the enemy to trick you out of thinking that anything that you want, that you are dealing with, that you cannot bring to God. That he's know your beginning from your end. So the reality of it is not bringing it to God is the problem, and that's the place that the enemy wants to keep you in. So don't work with him. Don't work with him. Whatever you have, whether it's discontentment or anything else, whether it's selfish ambition that you need to get to, you need to go underneath and, all right, I'm define success. And maybe after I define success, the Lord's going to peel back another layer, because this is like, therapy, if you will, Christian therapy, if you will, to help me peel back the layers of forming a character that allows me to sustain success. There's a lot of SUs. This SUs hate to see me coming. But yeah, I think that the Lord has me in a place of peeling back layers to make the next level sustainable. And I don't think that we think enough about that, like, because we see the overnight successes, or the people we believe to be overnight successes, or we see the 15 minutes of fame, but it's not help to make me sustainable in the faith, right? And in the work that you have me to do, Lord. Like, let that be our prayer. So I hope that this has blessed you. I hope it has helped you to realize that you are not alone in your walk, in your way of thinking, in your ability to grow in Christ. I hope it gave you hope. I hope it gave you, it's inspired you to want to read these passages of scripture and open up these pages, and the Lord meets you right there, and his manifest presence is present with you. I pray for that for you. I believe it can be done. Do you? So before we end, I just want to make sure you subscribe to the channel. The channel is growing. I am excited and prayerful about what happens next in in hopes that we can steward what we have right now in our hand as best as we can and to the will of God. And make sure you send this to your friends. Leave a comment. Would love to form a conversation with you. And yeah, I hope to see you soon. This has been another episode of Eat, Don't Compete. And I am your girl, Jasmine DeWeese. Peace.